Email auth allows you to validate a user using their email ID. So they can just send their email ID and get a one-time password as a link and log in using that. This is a pretty convenient alternative to something like DB Auth because there is no need for a user to sign up and there's no need to store the passwords. There's no need to create new accounts. And you can restrict access in any way just using their email ID, domain, or any other parameter. So let's take a quick look at how we create a, an email auth. There are two parts to this. The first is you need an email service. An email service is documented elsewhere on the Gramex guide, and you can take a look at that configuration. But effectively, it requires a service. For example, in this case, this is a dummy account where we'll be sending email through Gmail using the email ID gramex.guide@gmail.com and using an application specific password that was created for people to test out the Gramex guide. So this will actually work for you. And then you create an email auth handler and provide it a series of parameters. What I'll do is first show you how this works, and then we'll go into the details of the configuration. So I'm going to copy this configuration. Let's go to the IDE. We have a blank application, and the output of this application is just a dummy home page. In this, I'm going to go to the code editor, and in the code editor, take the gramex.yaml file, and let's see. We'll add. There is, yeah. I've added the URL section which has a login page. So now /login is where email auth is available. Let's go to /login. Now this asks me for an email ID. Let me put in an email ID here and send the password via email. Now this takes a second or two to send an email with a link to login. Let's check my email. I have an email from gramex.guide with the subject OTP for Gramex. And it says the OTP is a certain code. Now I can, if the form allowed, I could type that code in, or I could just click on this link, which has the code embedded in it. And when I do that, it automatically logs me in. Now, how do we know that we are in fact logged in? How do we know the details of the user that has logged in? Well, let's go back to the IDE. And what we'll do on the home page is make this a function handler. And this function handler specifically will report a function which has handler.session. Let's json.dump that with a small indentation, and this can have headers. We'll render this as application/json. So what we're doing is taking the handler session and rendering it as JSON on the home page. Let's take a quick look at what that's like. So we have the user as the email ID root.node@gmail.com that I'd specified, and it has the domain name, the high-level domain name specified, and it's mentioned that the user is active. So these are the user attributes for the user that has logged in. Let me log in as a different user. So /login. This time I'll specify, let's say root.node plus something. Dot node plus new at gmail.com. That will still send it to my email ID because of the way plus addressing works on Gmail. And let's go back. Now we have a second email. This says the OTP for root.node plus new is such and such, and I can click on this link to log in. And now it shows me the email ID as root.node plus new. So I've logged in as a new user onto this. So how does this work, and what are the things that we can configure? Let's go back to the configuration and look at each of the items. The login page uses an email auth, and it requires an email service to send email. We have configured the service as Gramex Guide Gmail. That's the name of the service. That's what we should specify here. If I changed this to something else, I'd have to change it here as well. And under that service, we specify the type of email, the email ID, and the password to login, all of which, like I mentioned earlier, is specified in the email service documentation. And that's a separate topic in itself. Let's go back. We can then say the subject that will be sent. In this case, the subject is OTP for Gramex. So that's what came through as a subject line here. Now, you can use templates in the subject line. So you can say, for example, OTP for user. And that, for example, OTP for, let's say, a particular user. So if I specified this, then it would have said OTP for my email ID or the email ID that I had sent as part of this request. Similarly, the body can contain any of these variables, the user, the password, or the link, and any combination of these. So here the body is a simple text body. The OTP for user is password, visit link. You can also specify a HTML content here where you can put in what we want in HTML using whatever is allowed in email. Now, what is displayed here is actually the HTML content. But if the client does not support HTML, then it would have rendered the plain text. There are some other optional configurations that we can specify. How long will the OTP expire after? So in this case, it's set to 15 minutes. What is the size of the OTP? We are specifying 6 characters. If you want something more secure, then you could specify 10 or however long. Keep in mind that shorter texts are easier to type out and longer texts are more secure. So you may want to trade off between these as you seem fit. There is an option for instant login. Now, this is an option where when we click on the link, it automatically logs the user in. And when we set it to true, what we get is a link like this that will automatically log the user in. But if this is set to false, then it will show a page with the code and then allow them to log in into the application by submitting. Now, there are some cases where you have a client like Outlook, which can prefetch the links. In that case, what might happen is even before the user clicks on this link, Outlook has already visited that link and the OTP expires. So to prevent scenarios like this, you could set instant login to false, and that is the default. You can also specify the user ID query parameter. So by default, it's set to user. So what that means is that the link will contain a question mark user and the name of the user input here. So the input here is actually named user. Secondly, we can also control the password argument, and that's set to password. So what that means is you'll get a question mark password is equal to something. And finally, you can decide how you want to redirect. This says that if there's a question mark next is equal to something, then it'll redirect there. So in our case, we got a question mark next is equal to %2f. That's the slash symbol. In other words, it says go to the home page. Or if the question mark next is not specified, it picks it up from the referrer, or if not, it goes to the current directory. These are standard redirect query parameters that will apply to all login URL or login authentications. And user and password are things that you probably wouldn't change most of the time. So this is a full walkthrough of how email auth is currently used. Remember that the attributes of the user, that is in handler.currentUser, will always have the following: ID, which is the email ID of the user. It's also stored in a field called email. And finally, you have HT, which is the high level domain. In this case, that's everything after the at. If you want to allow a page to be visible only for specific users, you can control that on any page using the auth parameter. So let's take an example. We'll add this to the home page. So this says that this homepage is visible only to people in the domains ibm.com and pwc.com, or to the URL or to the email admin@example.org. So what this means is that if I visit the homepage, then it says I can't because I'm logged in as this email ID, which is neither ibm.com nor pwc.com nor that specified email. So I could explicitly allow a specific domain. Let's say we allow gmail.com instead of pwc.com. So anyone in gmail.com can access it. So I can access it now. Or I could put in a specific email ID such as root.node+new@gmail.com, and that will still allow me to access it. But if I went back to the original configuration, I can no longer access it. There is one other parameter that you should be aware of, which is the template parameter. Now, the template gives us the login page itself. So when I go to /login, this renders a HTML form. And the contents of this form are created from an email template. You can configure this template using a series of variables. So here is a sample email template. And in this template, you can use a set of predefined variables like error, email, etc. Specifically, the parameters that you can use are handler, which refers to the current email auth. So you can get all the configurations that you need from handler.quarks. The email ID, if the user has typed in an email ID and submitted, then that email ID is available as the variable email. If they've typed in a password, then, or if they've submitted a password through the link, it's available as OTP. If there is an error, like for example, the password was not sent or the OTP is incorrect, then the error is set. And this can have one of two values. It'll either be not sent or wrong PW for if the OTP was not sent and if the OTP is wrong. Message is set if the error is specified, and it's a textual description of the error, and this is something that you could display to the user. Redirect has the URL that the user wants to send that the user URL should be that the user should be sent to in the post login link. So by default, it will be /, but if I set question mark, next is equal to, let's say, /homepage, then this next query parameter will be available in the redirect variable. In all, email auth is something that you can use to log users in without the need to store passwords and allowing them to log in simply based on their email ID.